Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. My guest today is Elaine Weiss. She is a terrific author and has a new book out that I think is really important. And it's a little off axis from what you might expect on our show normally, because it's not the immediate politics of right now, but it is something that struck me really hard, because the book is Spell Freedom. It's called The Underground Schools That Built the Civil Rights Movement. And Elaine talks in this book about a movement that occurred back in the 1950s as the civil rights movement was beginning to blossom, of underground schools. And I want to talk to her about that today, because I think that the citizenship that was taught in these schools by these mostly women was something that catalyzed a movement. And I think we may be lacking a degree of education and citizenship today, and it may be time for something else like it. So with that, I want to just welcome Elaine Weiss to the show. Elaine, thank you so much for coming on today. Talk to me about, first off, the history of the citizenship schools, and secondly, how you came to write this book.
The idea of the citizenship schools, of training, these were for adults, actually begins on a bus on Sea Islands off Charleston. And it's the idea of a man on John's Island, and he realizes he lives there. It's a mostly Black population, rural, very poor, totally neglected by the government, and also subject to terrible injustice in the court system, in every system. They're totally neglected. And he realizes he has to organize his neighbors in order to have any sort of power. And so he begins a political action group, as we might call, 10 cents a month. And you can, we'll have a legal defense fund. So if someone is wrongly accused. And then he realizes that you can't serve on a jury unless you are a registered voter. And that means you're being judged by white judges and white juries. And he says, we need to have more voters. And so he begins on his little jitney bus that he drives back and forth to teach the Constitution of South Carolina, which was part of the literacy test. It was a ridiculous test where not just reading and writing, it was to give you a legal interpretation of the statutes of South Carolina. It was totally ridiculous. And people who were even college educated, Black people, were denied registration. Anyway, he starts to teach from the steering wheel of the bus. He passes out his wife's typed the Constitution. They study it on the bus, going back and forth before dawn, pretty much, on this bus. And they mostly memorize it, those who can't read. And then he goes with them to the registration clerk to try to register. And he succeeds, 1, 2, 3 a month. And then he realizes that they need to read. They really need to do more than register. And so he is invited, and that's part of the book, he's invited to a training center. It's kind of social action training center in Tennessee. He brings this idea. He partners with a woman who had been his teacher on John's Island years and years ago. He only got up to 4th grade because that's how the schooling worked. And they together, Septima Clark and Esau Jenkins, have this idea of training adults to pass the literacy test. And then it moves to a grocery store behind the back shelves on this tiny rural island where they are secretly taught to read and write. and then to register. But they're taught much more, and that's something you touch on in your introduction.
Obviously, like reading was the empowering technology, but the realization that chaining, you go up that chain of citizenship, basically, where you have to be registered to vote. You have to be literate at that period if you're Black to be able to vote. You have to be knowledgeable enough of that Constitution to be able to pass that literacy test, to be able to vote and be on a jury. In all of this, did they see themselves as part of the broader civil rights movement? Or does this feel much more local to them? Because it starts in 1954, which is pretty much, very early in that civil rights phase that I think of as like from post-war through 68.
Actually, these were, it was not just like Rosa Parks, didn't come out of nowhere. These were NAACP activists. Septima Clark joined the NAACP, which was considered a radical movement, and there were repercussions, serious repercussions for membership. But both Esau and Septima Clark are part of an ongoing movement. Before we recognize in 54 that things are starting to move, they've been working in their own communities for years and years and years. So they are part of a sort of established movement, which is moving very slowly, and they're both very frustrated by this. And when the Brown decision comes down from the Supreme Court, it kind of opens up and serves as a catalyst for these activists to say, okay, we've got to move. We've got to get petitions to desegregate the schools. We've got to get voting rights front and center. And so, yes, they were working locally, but they were thinking nationally.
Okay. And South Carolina was a hard target. South Carolina was I would probably put Mississippi and South Carolina as two of the toughest states on the desegregation challenge scale in a lot of ways. What was the institutional opposition to this movement and
Rick,
their
that was,
work?
I think, the most startling, disturbing part of my research. And I'll admit, I did not know this. I didn't know the extent of the architecture, the official architecture of oppression.
Sure.
We have heard about the bloody police crackdowns in Birmingham, and of course we're about to celebrate the 60th anniversary of crossing the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma.
Pettus Bridge, yeah.
What the kind of opposition? I'll give you a little example. If you dared to try to register, meaning you can, you've learned to sign your name, you've learned how to read rudimentally at least, and you go to the registrar. You could also be a college graduate and go registrar. Same thing would happen. By the time you would be denied. But by the time you even got home, the registrar would have called your employer, and you'd be fired. The registrar would have called your land owner or landlady or whoever owned your domicile, and you would be evicted, and you and your family would be evicted. If you owned a house, your mortgage would be pulled. If you owned a truck, your loan would be pulled. The pharmacist would no longer fill prescriptions for your sick baby. You often were destitute. You tried to register to vote. And how was this accomplished? It was, again, this architecture. It started at, of course, the congressional level, where 101 Southern congressmen and senators signed something called the Southern Manifesto, which said, we are going to employ massive resistance we are not going to comply with the Supreme Court order to desegregate our schools, and they didn't, for the most part. Then there were citizens' councils in every city and city and town.
There still are.
They're called something different. But these were the mayor, your congressman, your state legislator, all the bankers, white bankers in town, all the lawyers, the doctors, sometimes your pastors. These were the power elite of every city and town. And they were called the Uptown Clan because they didn't do the dirty work. They actually got the Klan to do the dirty work. They did the economic and political and social freeze. It was called the squeeze. So you lost your job. If you were a small-time Black farmer, your cotton wouldn't be milled. Your lumber wouldn't be cut. If you owned a gas station, your gasoline tanks would not be filled, and sometimes they pulled them out. You also were subject, you again lose your job and you'd be blackballed. Nobody in town. So families had to break up because the dad had to go off and find a job in another state. It ruined families. And then there was physical harassment and death. Night riders would come and shoot up your house if you tried to register to vote. So I think that was really shocking to me to see the pervasive violence, economic violence, and physical violence. And that was all over. That was not just one.
I think that's fascinating because I do think we have culturally a kind of cinematic understanding of civil rights now. That is, it's like one day you do something, cross the line, and the Klan burns your house down the next day. But it really was an uglier, kind of more systemic and kind of more institutionalized process, as you write about, that wasn't always as dramatic. You could achieve the same ends without. I mean, not that they wouldn't murder people or assault them, but they managed to achieve the same ends in a way that let their conscience feel like,
exactly.
Oh, well, at least I'm not
they had others who did that. And then there's another layer that again was very surprising to me, but I think is really important. Almost every southern state had established a segregation protection agency. This was an official agency. Was often the governor was the titular head, and it was empowered. It was given a lot of money, a lot of power. It had, in some states, it had subpoena power. In others, it had actual law enforcement powers. And these, again, worked with the white citizens councils to coordinate this kind of intimidation and punishment for voting rights or any kind of civil rights activity. So in Mississippi, there was the State Sovereignty Commission, which spied on its own citizens. If you went to a meeting, a civil rights meeting, just as a citizen of the United States, there were policemen in the parking lot taking down your license plate number. And then you would be harassed on the road. Black people would be just arrested, put in jail, fined much more than they could ever pay. This was, and then they were again. This is official. They churned out propaganda. They churned out radio programs. They actually had their own national radio programs. Yeah. Yes,
say more about that. I've never heard about that.
And so in Louisiana, it was, I think, called the Commission to Preserve the Peace. Yeah. So every state had some version of this, and they worked with the state legislature to make sure there was legislation. In South Carolina, there was legislation and in many to outlaw the NAACP. So if you were a member of the NAACP, you could not be a municipal or state worker. So teachers were fired for belonging to the NAACP. And my main character, Septima Clark, is fired after 40 years of teaching, loses her pension, but she goes on and joins the movement. And she, becomes very important in helping organize throughout the South. But it gives you an idea of the official power. It wasn't just Klansmen, trigger-happy Klansmen. It was an official architecture of oppression.
Let me ask you a question. I don't know how much you cover this in the book, but after World War II, where where you have the desegregation of the military beginning to percolate up. You have a slow growing understanding that the system cannot hold, and that there's not necessarily such a great economic benefit from maintaining the system as there was a cultural belief structure to maintain the system. I'm going to digress for a second. When I grew up, and we had a hunt camp that our family and some other families went to, and this guy, classic white old Florida cracker, as they call him down here, he had left Florida once in his life, and that was to go fight in World War II. And this is a guy who, and remember, I'm 60 years old, so this is in the 1970s, and this is a guy on paper you would have expected to be the biggest racist in America. He's like, no, I saved my ass a couple times, and absolutely, it's like the war was this catalyzing thing for him, and he understood like everybody was fighting against evil. It wasn't just white guys fighting against evil; it was all of us. And I'm curious if that how that post-war era affected the expectations of Black Americans who were trying to become fully empowered citizens.
World War II and Korea. Remember, many American soldiers and Black soldiers were serving in Korea in the early 50s. So those wars really made a difference. I write in the book about after World War II, when Black soldiers came back to the South, and things were not rosy for them in the military. It wasn't yet desegregated, but they came back in their uniforms, and they felt they had served their country. Many of them had died, but those who came back, there's this incredible story that comes out of South Carolina of Isaac Woodard, who's a young soldier, comes back, is on the bus the day he's been demobilized, going home to his rural home in South Carolina, and he is the bus driver doesn't like his attitude because he's soldierly and he's wearing the American uniform, and he doesn't think Black men should have that stature. And he bus driver radios ahead to the sheriff in the next town, and Isaac Woodard is beaten and blinded in a just. And there were lynchings after the Black soldiers came home because the white establishments in their towns couldn't bear the idea that they were veterans just like anyone else, and they were wearing the uniform. So there was a huge backlash in America, in the South, against those who had served their country. And this catalyzes, these men come home and they see what their life is like. It's still, like the antebellum time. And it's not slavery, but it is a version of slavery. And so it's those young men who now in early 1950s or in their 30s have families. They say, I don't want my children to grow up like this. And they're the ones who are initiating the desegregation suits. They're the ones. If you look at the Brown decision, it's five different cases coming from different states, and they're, for the most part, I can't say all of them, but several are young veterans, young Black veterans who say, I'm going to have my children live in a better world here, a better country.
So, Elaine, what is a lesson you think we should take away from this book about today?
Well, I think I agree with you, Rick, that part of the citizenship schools that spread to 11 southern states and trained, estimate is sort of like 50 to 100,000 new voters.
Wow.
And not only
considering the era and the percentage of the Black population,
yes,
that's an enormous number. Even the low end of that margin is an enormous number.
It goes on from about 1957 when the first one opens to 1970. So it's about 13 years. But more than that, it influenced others, because if someone in your family did this, well, maybe they're convincing. They all joined citizens clubs in their towns, and concerned voters of whatever city they were in, and so it becomes not only the grassroots foundation, so that in the schools they learn the Constitution, they learn Black history, very important to understand what the nation has been like. They learn how the government works, so that they understand that if they want to make change at the city council level, this is what you have to do. They learn to write protest letters. And one of the things they learn is to also compliment your elected official when they do something good. They learn to be, as Septima Clark called them, first-class citizens, that they deserve it and they can demand it and they should organize to achieve it. And so this becomes the grassroots foundation for the whole movement. So when Martin Luther King comes to town to lead a march or a campaign, they're ready and they know what they're fighting for. And the citizenship school teachers, who are just neighbors, they're just volunteers who get trained to do this, to learn a curriculum, they become the local commanders of the movement as it moves across the South. So I think that idea of becoming a citizen, both your privileges and your responsibilities. You have a responsibility as a citizen. And this is so important, both for a sense of confidence and agency, but understanding how it works. So it's not a black box. I think a lot of people today who kind of check out of politics or their responsibilities as a voting citizen think it's a black box. Oh, it all gets done. It's, my vote's not going to count. It's all fixed, whatever ideas they have. It's very often because they really don't understand how government works or how their local government works. And I think that we've lost that. It's not taught in schools very much. It's not even taught in colleges very much. So I think that sense of education, of that you're born as an American citizen. Yes, there is birthright citizenship. Yes, there is. But you also have to learn to be a citizen. You learn to drive a car. You have to learn, and you have to be invested in it. And I think that's something we've lost, and we're paying for it. I think we're paying for it.
I think that's right. Well, Elaine Weiss, I think this is a valuable book, especially right now when there is a very concerted and deeply conceived effort to erase Black history in this country, which I think is an unforgivable. As a guy steeped in history, the ideological nature of trying to erase Black history on the right now is truly egregious. But I think this is a very valuable book. Thank you so much for writing Spell Freedom, the underground schools that built the civil rights movement. Folks, this is an area of history in American life that I think is underserved, and I think you'd be well inspired to read this book. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, Elaine. I really appreciate it. We'll look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.